Hi, this is Zachary and Elizabeth, and thanks for tuning in to Simply Enough.
If you're liking our podcast, we'd love it if you'd share with your friends and family.
And then rate and review to raise our visibility and spread the message of enoughness.
We love you, and remember, you are simply enough.
Just as you are.
Period. Welcome to Simply Enough, where we celebrate you.
Because you are enough. Just as you are.
Period.
So that's kind of where I'm coming in today, which is a recognition of the steps that I took to participate in the cultivation of the impression of that person.
So we are very quick to be more familiar with casting somebody else in the lead role at our own discomfort. When we are not coming from a place of a sense of enoughness, that is a place of discomfort.
And you also challenge us to think about discomfort can be okay because there will be moments of quote unquote successes and quote unquote failures, but you're still progressing in the way in which you step into a place of assertiveness. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Simply Enough. I'm Mr. Zachary Leonard.
And I'm Dr. Elizabeth Ignacio.
And welcome to episode 16. It still floors me every time I think about how far we've come in our podcast journey. So thank you for being a part of it. And to any newcomers, welcome. Welcome to Simply Enough with us. Last episode, we were talking about forgiveness, and I shared a story about essentially my coming out process with my father and the journey that we went through, and ultimately the culminating moment prior to my wedding when I spoke to my dad about what I needed and wanted prior to our wedding. And what I wanted to bring up today was just a reflection on that story. And I want to talk aloud a little bit of what I noticed I was doing in that story and put it out there and dig into it a little bit with you, Elizabeth. So thank you for letting me have the moment to do that and to just see where this episode goes. So for those of you that listen to the episode on forgiveness, you may or may not have noticed this, but in case you didn't, I was talking about my dad, and in the launch of the story, I kind of tipped the ending a little bit, which was, I said, I'm gonna tell a story about when I came out to my dad, but all is okay. You know, we're in a good place now. Like, and then as the story went on, continued to tell where we were at, right? Rather than just let the story kind of unfold. And I know that I have family that listens. I also know that there are new people that I don't know that are listening that don't know who my dad is and whatnot. And upon looking at the video again and listening to it again, I was like, wow, I was really working very hard to shape people's impressions of my father. And just in a moment of observation, I was just noticing that. I was and curious as to, okay, how many times did I do it? And then I sat with why over the weekend. You know, what was my thinking? And if I could get back into that place of when I was telling the story, what my thinking was. Because I love you so much, Elizabeth. And I also realized that some of that work is thinking out loud with you. I didn't want to dig into it too much because you ask such great questions. You also have such wonderful insights that I put a little bit of a pause on the analysis of it to bring it here today, even though initially I latched onto this idea of trying to protect people's impressions of my father. So that's kind of where I'm coming in today, which is a recognition of some of my behaviors during last week's episode, as it pertained to a story involving somebody else, and the steps that I took to participate in the cultivation of the impression of that person. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense, and
Yeah.
it was actually very reflective of another component of what we talked about in last week's episode, which is casting yourself as the lead role in your own life story, which again, how else can we live our life other than that way? That's just the law of nature. I noticed that as well as you were telling such a very, very powerful, poignant, personal story that you kept almost interrupting yourself to paint a picture of your father, who you had already indicated from the beginning, as you said, you're at a beautiful place in your relationship, with the both of you coming together and recognizing who each person is. And yet you were so quick to deflect and not make yourself the center of the story, even
Yeah.
though the whole point is you are the center of the story. And it's often a reflection of our not feeling enough ourselves, that we won't put ourselves in the lead
Mhm.
role of our
Mhm.
story. And when we are not coming from a place of a sense of enoughness internally on our own, that is a place of discomfort. So we are very quick to be more familiar with placing the spotlight and casting somebody else in the lead role at our own discomfort. And that's what you did there with the story of you, yet it became so much about the story of your dad. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. And if I can add something to it really quickly, just to throw a wrench in this, is when I have told that story before, I generally take it even a step further by sharing, I guess maybe like the sequel or the part two, which is at our wedding, we asked our parents if they would be involved, and I went to Notre Dame. Uh, I'm not really Irish. I'm a very small, little bit Irish, but being a fighting Irish, like it kind of becomes a thing with my family. We're just like diehard Notre Dame fans. But anyway, the Irish blessing is near and dear to my family's hearts, near and dear to the folk choir that I was a part of. We sung a beautiful version of it. So I asked if we could have that as a part of the ceremony. So it was, and we asked our parents to read the Irish blessing at the wedding. Okay. And now at this point, I know that my dad's going to be there. So this is the part of the story where I go even further to like paint a picture of my dad, right? So I'm just
Mhm.
sharing what I didn't say in the story, and then also why I didn't. And so maybe there was a little bit of a check about putting myself as the leading player, even though there were still moments where I didn't. So let me just wrap up that story. So as my parents agreed that they were going to read the Irish blessing with Kevin's parents, my dad gets up with my mom, stands in front of our friends and family, and says, totally off script, a blessing for our sons. Right. So of course I
Oh,
started crying. Right. Beautiful,
yeah,
beautiful
that's
moment,
so kind.
really touching. Lovely, lovely, lovely. Often when I tell the coming out story and that moment of really speaking my truth to my dad and saying, I don't want you there if it's not going to be about me. And I always add that other story as if to show how far my dad came, rather than leaving the story just about me stepping into my own spotlight, so to speak. So I didn't tell that part of the story. So clearly, I omitted that part consciously, subconsciously, unconsciously, whatever. But yet I still had those other moments where it was like, so if you see Uncle Bobby, or we're in a great place, or, we've come a long way. Yeah. So I still did it. Anyway. Okay. So I just wanted to add that little facet of the story too.
Right. Because again, you're not used to lifelong. You are not used to or feel comfortable with being the lead role in your story.
Mhm.
As you and I have talked about being people pleasers,
Mhm.
um, it is at the expense of oneself. There's a saying actually, if everybody's your friend, then you're not a friend to yourself. If you're trying to be pleasing to everybody and be all things to everybody, there's just no way that you really can be there for yourself. But if we have learned to live our life that way, whether that was applauded, approved, or whether that was a defense mechanism or all of the
Mhm.
above, when that becomes not only familiar, but then comfortable. So, again, if we find ourselves in a place of discomfort and feeling uncomfortable, we are very quick then to remove ourselves from that lead role in the story and be very quick to talk about others and please others, as a validation of oneself.
Yeah.
Whereas as opposed to finding within, aligning with oneself and feeling comfortable in the lead role of one's own life story. Total trivial story on my part. I was born in the Philippines. I'm an immigrant, have an American name, Elizabeth, and even growing up, I have a nickname. And that was a childhood nickname, and by childhood I'll say even college and even med school. But then through residency, fellowship, and beyond, oftentimes my attendings, which are the professors in medical school, the attendings, would see my name, my legal name as Elizabeth, and would call me Elizabeth, and it just was not worth it to me to change or correct them and give them my nickname. And so, like, half my life is my nickname, and my adult half, I've been going by Elizabeth, almost by default. I don't even know why I said almost by default, because there's another story that I want to add to that. But anyway,
Okay.
and but yet now that I moved back to my childhood home of Hawaii, there are people who knew me from when I was, growing up, and therefore know me by my nickname. But also because now that I am living back at my childhood home, other people who never knew me as a youth, but hear other people call me by my nickname, also will call me by my nickname, even though they didn't know me when I was growing up with my nickname. And I don't not use my nickname. Like I said, there are people who know me from a certain part of my life that know me by my nickname. And I love that. And it's almost awkward if they call me Elizabeth. But it's equally awkward when people who don't know me, when I was younger by my nickname, call me by my nickname as opposed to Elizabeth. It took me a long time to kind of define that for myself of I'm my nickname to these people and I'm Elizabeth to these people. And I felt that it would, though I was feeling uncomfortable based on what people were calling me, I wouldn't assert myself because it was more important to me to make them comfortable. So I will take on the discomfort so that they're more comfortable. And there was a little bit of a flipping point when I wasn't attending at this point. So meaning, I'm a professor, if you will, and there was a industry rep, a surgical rep. So these are the reps that are of the companies of the implants that I use in orthopedic surgery, and they're in the operating room. And one was feeling super comfortable with me, even though I didn't really know this person, but feeling super comfortable. And I couldn't help but wonder, are you being so casual and almost flippant with me because I'm a woman orthopedic surgeon compared to, the male orthopedic surgeon. So that's always, I will admit, that's always a little bit in the back of my mind. But this person kept calling me Liz. So didn't know my nickname, kind of knew that I had a nickname though, because I think he might have heard other people calling me that. And so he would keep calling me Liz. And I have a couple of dear friends who are named Liz. Beautiful name. I love them, but Liz is not my own name. And so I don't like to be called Liz. That's just not my name. So I corrected him and I said, I don't go by Liz. You can call me Elizabeth. And this person, this rep, who I hate to say this sounds so, but he's there to actually be of service to me. I'm like his client. I'm like his customer. Yet he's now debating with me. Well, what's the matter with Liz? Why don't you like Liz? What's your problem with Liz? I'm like, I have no problem with it. Yeah, I have no problem with the name Liz. Liz is a beautiful name. I have dear friends that are named Liz. I am just not Liz. So please don't call me Liz. And he just kept badgering and badgering and badgering until I finally said, that is not my name. okay, if you're going to choose a name for me, even though I'm telling you that that's not my name, then I'll choose a name for you, Dick,
Mhm.
which obviously that wasn't his name, but my,
Bam.
yeah, okay, Dick, that's what I'm going to call
Yeah.
you. Wink, wink. You know what I mean by that.
Yep.
But it almost like was a boiling point for me, because up
Mhm.
until that point, have so just swallowed people calling me Liz or
Mhm.
Beth or Eliza or anything,
Yep.
because it's quote uncomfortable for them. I don't know. Is too many syllables to use the word Elizabeth? I don't know, but
Mhm.
they're more comfortable, or they want to feel comfortable with me by giving me a nickname that they're comfortable with, even though it's
Mhm.
not my name. Um, that's just a very small uh, story of how it's so easy to take on one's own uncomfortableness to make somebody else feel more comfortable at your expense. Does that make
Mhm.
sense?
It does. And I don't think so a couple episodes ago when I said, oh, it's kind of a silly example of the idea of holding doors, and you're like, no, actually it's a really great it's a great example. I don't think that there's anything trivial about the moment when you share a story about how those of us that have names that can be nicknamed, so to speak, and people make assumptions or decide, when that is a loss of your own personal identity. Your name is your identity. There is nothing more that captures placing yourself in the leading role of your own show than asserting yourself and saying, no, that's not my name. I can't think of a better example, Dr. Elizabeth Ignacio, than that. I think that's incredibly spot on. Incredibly spot on.
It, the,
So,
but
yeah.
it's so funny, the angst though, that
Yep.
for my I'm an adult at this point, and for
Hmm.
my adult life, the angst when people would call me by the wrong name, Beth or Liz, and it would eat at me, but I would just let it slide, because I'll let it eat at me for the sake of you feeling more comfortable. um and it just shows though how it's when we're familiar
Hmm.
with taking that role, that familiarity becomes
Hmm.
comfort, if you will.
Hmm.
It's not good for us and it's not healthy for us, but it's familiar and therefore
Hmm.
ironically comfortable. How important it is, therefore, to step out on the edge of that comfort
Hmm.
zone and take on that leading role in your
Hmm.
story. You know, I also had read, when you are used to being a doormat, then asserting yourself, not being aggressive, but just asserting yourself is uncomfortable.
Hmm.
But that doesn't mean you're wrong to do
Hmm.
so. It's just contextually what was wrong, for lack of a better word, was being a doormat.
Hmm.
But when you're familiar with being a doormat and almost being comfortable, then
Hmm.
being on the edge of your comfort zone and asserting yourself is uncomfortable.
Hmm.
But that's actually where growth is. And that's where we need to live, is
Hmm.
at the edge
Hmm.
of our comfort zone, of our own comfort zone, and pushing those
Hmm.
edges. Because sometimes what might be comfortable for us or what might be familiar for us is not what's healthy or what's good for
Hmm.
us.
Hmm. Your story is really inspiring, and I just reflecting out loud can think of a bunch of different ways that directly applies to me in small measurable moments. So like, I can't eat dairy. I just can't. It doesn't like me. And yet, when I go to somebody's house or I go out to eat with somebody, or let's say a group of people, they want to share appetizers or whatnot, there's a, hey, can we all get this? And I have that moment of like, well, I don't want to tell them. So I'll just like, maybe I'll put it on my plate or I just won't eat it or whatever. There's never that moment of like, you guys go ahead. I'm not going to participate because I can't have dairy. I'm getting better about that. Even with my name, I love being called Zachary. That's how I introduce myself. I think our listeners, Elizabeth, can relate in even the smallest ways of these small steps that can start to get them more comfortable asserting themselves. And maybe not even asserting, but just taking a stand, literally standing in your place, right? And not moving. That's different than taking a step forward, but just standing in your place.
But
What?
standing in your place, if I may, sorry to interrupt, but standing in your place is to them,
Oh, yes.
to the person that's used to being a
Exactly.
doormat,
Exactly.
to them standing there and affirming oneself can feel uncomfortable, like it is assertion or even arrogance, when all it is actually is standing firm.
That's exactly why I brought it up,
Yeah.
because that is two steps is taking a step forward. One step is just almost standing in your place. And that's why I brought it up, because your story, I think, is inspiring. And I would love to know how you built up that inertia to take yourself from doormat to standing and then saying, no, my name is actually Elizabeth. What did you do? Or how did you get there?
I handled it poorly, to be perfectly honest. If you can, in that, like, was that my best moment? Was that my best self to,
he was a dick.
To spew out to some guy, okay, I'm going to call you Dick. Like, was that really my best moment? No. So I actually handled it poorly. Now, though, I will just very firmly but kindly say, oh, I'm sorry, I don't go by Liz. Mm-hmm. And then if they say, well, what can I call you? You go by a nickname. You can call me Elizabeth. Mm-hmm. With kindness and with a smile, without excuse and without apology. Mm-hmm. When it's because when we can get to the place of, okay, this is uncomfortable, but I'm going to be okay with this uncomfortable feeling. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It actually removes the power, mm-hmm, little by little, of that discomfort, to the point where it becomes no big deal. Mm-hmm. And then even comes to the point of it being familiar, and now you're comfortable with it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So if I can just share something that I had recently read, when you're, where is it? Oh, please save it. What is it? When you're used to being passive, assertiveness feels like aggression. Mm-hmm. When you're not used to getting your needs met, prioritizing yourself feels selfish. Mm-hmm. So that's where, again, getting out of one's comfort zone, just because it's comfortable and just because it's familiar, and that just because that's what you're used to doing, doesn't mean it's good for you or healthy for you. Mm-hmm. And that's where we have to stand in our place, as you say, and feel comfortable, or get to a place of being comfortable, of that edge of the comfort zone. Another thing I'm going to say is, I'll say this as a Filipina, it is very important, and still is, and I espouse this too, of having respect for one's elders. It's mm-hmm, very ingrained in the Filipino culture. Mm-hmm. And part of that, and I love that, actually, as that should be the case. But part of that is, shall we say, demonstrable affection, mm-hmm, for your elders, in terms of hugs and kisses when they enter the room, or when they leave the room, or when you enter the room or you leave the room, the hug and the kiss. Mm-hmm. What I'm now recognizing, now that I'm older myself, and my discomfort as a child, and now as a parent, as I, look at and watch my kids as they grow up, which is that forced hug, mm-hmm, and that forced kiss with a stranger, just because they're older, is something quite uncomfortable for a kid. And not only is that uncomfortable, but it's dangerous, actually, to force that when they themselves have their own sense of evolving boundary setting and evolving comfort level. Yet we are so quick to make that normal and force that comfort level on what is actually quite naturally and inherently uncomfortable, and should be honored. But we strip away the ability to stand in place for one's sense of boundary. And we not only strip away, but we almost shame the child by saying that's disrespectful to your elders. Mm-hmm. Whereas you can still show love and respect without having to demonstrably and physically touch if that particular person feels uncomfortable. Now, having said, I mean, I'm huggy wuggy by nature. And so, like, you know, but I also recognize other people where COVID has been wonderful because it's removed that pressure of
Yep.
having to hug somebody.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that's okay.
It's totally okay. You just delivered a platter of delicious topics that I just want to like take a little nibble off of all of them. Okay, so the first thing that I just want to like take a just a big fork of is what you just gave in terms of a tremendous gift for those of us, all of us who are still learning to stand our ground, which is it's a skill. You might quote
Yes.
unquote fail. You might reflect later like I could have done that better. Gap versus gain mentality, that but you're still tried, right? And the
Yes.
people that you may identify in your life who do it quote unquote well doesn't mean that they didn't have their failures too, where they asserted themselves, they stood their ground, or maybe even took a step forward and messed it up. That doesn't, you just may only see the gains that they've made and
Yes.
assume that the space between where you are and where they are is unattainable. It's not. You
Right.
just may have to fail, and there'll be times when you'll succeed. And you're like, okay, that went well, right? Or you may
Yes.
see somebody else do it, the language that they did it, or maybe somebody listening right now will say, I kind of like Dr. Ignacio's approach. I'm going to do that. And be like, hey, Dick, my name is Caleb. Don't call me Cal. I don't know. So there's that little nibble. The permission, give yourself permission to try and then later reflect on like how that felt for you, because you, in stepping out of your comfort zone, you also have to find where your comfort zone is as you move forward. So there's
Yeah.
that piece of it. The next piece is, oh my God, it's just the platter of yummy goodness that you delivered. So my sister and I were talking about two individuals that we know that had the very conversation about when they have children, they are going to tell their kids that they have to hug their grandparents or they have to, kiss their so and so's. And my sister was arguing for exactly what you're saying, which is if that removes the ability of that young child to understand where their own personal boundaries can be set by them. And that as you get older, can become very problematic. And I don't even want to go down that road of all of the different ways that your physical boundaries can be taken advantage of by other people. Just extrapolate larger into what you're saying, that the way we treat children and the way that we help them see their boundary setting is so crucial as they move into adulthood and they understand how to take a stand and also maybe assert themselves. I've been watching, I have seen a couple of videos lately that speak to this in a sweet kind of way. There are videos of teachers who greet their children at the door. Okay. Now, this was a habit of mine, and I think you know where I'm going with this, but this was a habit of mine as a kindergarten teacher was I always said hello to every child, always, because I wanted you to know when you walked into my classroom, you were seen and you were valued. Okay. And then we played games where we did the same thing. Now, it wasn't ever like you have to give me a hug or anything. And I think maybe I fist bumped them, but there are teachers out there taking it a step further and they have a little chart or they have something. There's this awesome teacher who does it a little differently where he has like a special handshake with each child. But the kids come in and they get to choose that day how they want to greet their teacher. Okay. The expectation is that they have to greet the teacher. Eye contact, maybe that's it, right? But anything beyond that is the child's choice. That's not trivial, right? That is incredibly powerful to a child. In the same way that your story is not trivial, there is nothing more characteristic and definable of your identity than your own name. So these children get to come in, they get to slap, the fist bump, they get a fist bump, maybe a hug, maybe a shimmy shake, right?
Yeah.
Or they do a little dance, or nothing. They just say hello when they walk in. But what is that? What message is that teacher sending to that child or those children, which is, I respect your boundaries and you get to decide where they are that day. And they can change. And that child is learning to take a stand or assert themselves at young ages, or even, there's the high school one where the teacher has all these handshakes with all the kids and they're intricate. I mean, they're super cool. But so that's my little takeaway platter from the delicious dish that you put forward of the idea of failure is part of the learning process when you develop the skill of asserting yourself or taking a stand, and that's okay. And then
And
go ahead.
and when we talk about boundaries, I mean, the idea that we were talking about in terms of like greeting your elders, and
Mhm.
yeah, it has to be a hug and a kiss for the teachers. Yes, the obvious boundary there is physical, right?
Right.
And again, we that's another issue, but there's the physical, but just the underlying
Mhm.
undercurrent lesson overall is that your boundaries and your needs don't matter. Others
Mhm.
um, other people's needs matter more. That's where people pleasing comes from,
Mhm.
because it invalidates your own story, your own lead role, and puts others on a pedestal to your detriment. That's
Mhm.
where the people pleasing comes from. That's
Mhm.
where the not enough comes from,
Mhm. Absolutely.
physical or non-physical. It's, physical or subconscious.
Mhm.
That lesson gets learned and then perpetuated and validated. That's
Mhm.
where it's dangerous, is that lesson gets validated, that your boundaries, your needs are, it is not, doesn't matter. It's for, it's other people, so you need to people please. And that's when it gets more important to make other people more comfortable at your expense, or make other people get the spotlight even though it's your own story.
Mhm. And I love that you brought up the example of children because, and we say this often when we reflect on things that we've either seen or maybe behaviors that we've done. At the root of it are well-intentioned people, right? Or a well-intentioned culture or society that is just needs a reframing. You can demonstrate respect to your elders. You can demonstrate holding boundaries in a way that still preserves whatever the core of that intention is. Okay, so in the case of my sister and the friends that, or the people that we know, at the core they just want their children to demonstrate the love that they have for their grandparents. That is a beautiful thing,
Yes,
but at what
absolutely.
cost, I think, is where you're pushing us to see, at the cost of that child no longer seeing themselves as in control of their own lives and their own bodies.
Mhm.
You served up a platter. For those of us that are at works in progress in learning to cast ourselves as the leading role, I'm just going to speak bluntly or frankly about my own self. That feels so daunting, that these small little moments to to step or to stand up instead of being the doormat, to literally stand up, of no, I prefer Zachary, or actually you guys go ahead, I'm dairy free, I you please enjoy, I can't participate. These little moments are the moments that then compound to become, well, I want to tell you the story of my coming out, and I'm going to tell it from my perspective, that sometimes some tasks can feel somewhat insurmountable when actually they're just the progression of little steps that get you there rather than one big step.
And we've talked about that in previous episodes, whether it's this or whether it's goal creation, it's not
Right.
always about the big step. It's the next step. That's all. The next step.
There there are times when we have episodes, Elizabeth, in such a good way that I walk away with my brain just pinging, right? And I live in a place of my brain just being saturated with all these ideas. Then there are moments in our episodes where I walk away with my brain pinging, and then I also feel like I have actionable steps. I have things that I can take out and directly apply or do or try. I'm in both of those places right now.
Mm.
And I think that's such a beautiful spot given the topic that we elevated, which is really casting yourself as the leading player of your own story. We started talking, or we started this episode where I was reflecting about my story with my dad and how we both observed, and probably our listeners, maybe you did too, observed the number of times that I made my story about my father, or I took it back to him, and in an effort to shape people's perceptions of my dad rather than keep the story about me. From there, you went into, I think I would say, a beautiful capture of an opportunity for those of us to really try a small but very meaningful step of casting themselves as a leading player, because that ultimately is what we're talking about might be challenging for some of us who are people pleasers. And that is simply just saying your name, right? Or saying something that you may see as like a place of discomfort by pushing somebody or just standing your ground, and but it's actionable for many of us, whether it's you don't want to eat something or the way somebody says their name, or maybe your identity. I know many people who call themselves bisexual, but people refer to them as gay, and they don't want to like, say, oh no, it's actually bi. They don't want to do that. By just giving us that real tangible example, you gave all of us an opportunity to think about small ways in which we actually make ourselves a supporting character, not a leading character. Okay. And you also challenge us to think about discomfort can be okay, because there will be moments of successes, quote unquote successes, and quote unquote failures, but you're still progressing in the way in which you step into or stand up from your doormat position into a place of assertiveness. And just that standing up can feel super uncomfortable, right? But it's, for those of us, that's an important step, right? And then from there, we went into the ramifications of teaching children, either positively that they can create their own boundaries, or potentially dangerously that their boundaries are not theirs. What we now have out of this episode is not only cerebral things to think about, which is ourselves as our leading players and discomfort and spotlight, but we also have, I think everyone listening to this episode has at least one thing that they are automatically thinking of directly applies to ways in which maybe they cast themselves as a sporting character and will move themselves into trying to put themselves as the leading player. So I think this episode just hits on both levels, both the cerebral and the actionable level. And as a teacher, I have to say, that's a win as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I'm glad. I'm glad. Comfort zones are definitely not a good benchmark to
Right.
stay in. And even when we use the word comfort, again, I just have to keep saying comfort isn't necessarily good or healthy for you.
Mhm.
So if we take, for example, comfort foods. Okay, we place so much weight on comfort foods, like, oh, these French fries,
Mhm.
or this, chocolate, and this, greasy thing, or this fatty thing. Number one, is it really
Mhm.
comforting? Most of the time, it actually, at least as adults, the youth might not be agreeing, but as adults, we find that, I'll go to McDonald's and order a Big Mac fries and shake, and
Mhm.
because it's comfort food. And while I'm eating it, if I'm totally mindful and present, I recognize, I don't
It's
know
so
why
true.
I'm eating this. I'm not really digging it, but it's comforting, in
So
quotes.
true.
And then I deal with the discomfort of like the nausea that I
Yep.
feel afterwards. But because I have invested so much meaning and value in comfort,
Mm.
comfort food, comfortable, comfort zone, I'm actually not being healthy towards myself. So, comfort zone is not a good benchmark. And again, that's where, if I can just reiterate again what we've said, which is when you're not used to being confident, confidence feels like arrogance, but it's not. When you're used to being passive, assertiveness feels like aggression, but it's not. When you're not used to getting your needs met, prioritizing yourself feels selfish, but it's not. You are, like it or not, the leading role in the life that you lead. That is just the law of nature. Why give that role away to somebody else so that you're the supporting role in the life that you're leading? Just as you are, simply enough, just as you are. You are the leading role. Step to the edge of your comfort zone.
Thank you so much for listening to us and being a part of our Simply Enough journey. We love you guys. We're so grateful that you are with us. And Dr. Elizabeth Ignacio, just thank you for being you.
Thank you, Zachary. And I'm specifically using your name, Zachary. Love you.
Love you.
1 + 1 = 3. We make each other better, and I hope that we're all better. Love you.
So let's blow our
Bye.
kisses. Yep. Mwah.
Bye, everybody.